affordable interest payments. As Milton Friedman taught, spending is the real measure of government's burden on the private economy, and reducing it leaves more resources for private actors to spend and invest, end quote. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you. The point they're trying to make here is that government spending is a pretty good indicator of what is left over for the private sector to invest and spend, for example, on new jobs. And when the government spends more, inevitably it has to borrow more, 40 cents on every dollar, or increase taxes. Either way, reducing what's available for the private sector to invest and to hire. And as a result, we should be focused, this editorial notes, we should be focused on reducing wasteful Washington spending and allowing the genius of the American people to do what Senator Rubio has made very clear we've always had the capability of doing, unfettered by too much government taxation or regulation, and that is to create jobs. So we need to do away with those policies like the Fed policy that reduced the value of the dollar. We need to try to eliminate as many regulations that burden American people as possible. And we need to avoid raising taxes. Now, bear in mind, we're not talking about cutting taxes. We're not talking about cutting taxes for the wealthy or cutting taxes for business or cutting taxes for people generally. Just leave them alone. Just don't raise them is all we're saying. So when you hear some politicians say, well, you want to cut taxes for the wealthy or give oil companies big tax breaks. No, no, leave it alone. Just don't touch it. Let businesses and families, small businesses, do what they've always done best. And if you want to mess up the economic growth, to use the colloquialism, then just follow the policies that the administration has been pursuing since the beginning, which have meant higher unemployment, higher gas prices, higher federal debt, higher debt per person, and higher health insurance premiums, not to mention other pernicious effects here. Those policies have made it worse, not better. And that's why Republicans have said, don't force us to raise taxes as part of this increase in the debt ceiling. Let's reduce spending, and let's enforce that through a balanced budget amendment and other kinds of spending constraints. We're not talking about drastic cuts, as I said. Think about this again. The Ryan budget that passed the House and that most of us on the Republican side voted for over here adds $5 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. That's $500 billion a year. That's higher than any other budget deficit in history until President Obama came into office. They talk about the Bush budget deficits. Well, it's a lot higher than any deficit under President Bush. $500 billion a year for 10 years. That's another $5 trillion. You can't say that that's drastically cutting spending. The alternative, though, is the Obama budget, which would add $12 trillion. At least the Ryan budget gets us on a path where we can get back in balance and get back to the standard or normal or historical average of spending as a percent of our gross domestic product, around 20%. And if you don't like that budget, then produce one that you think will get us to the same place. We've laid that challenge down. Our Democratic colleagues have not produced a budget, and it's pretty obvious that they're not going to do so. That's why we've had to have these discussions with the Vice President. At least perhaps in those, as a conclusion to those discussions that the President is now involved in, we can make a big down payment on spending reductions. We can set the budget levels for the next several years that represent a real reduction. It doesn't have to be huge. Even a $30 billion reduction over last year will save a huge amount of money in the out years. We need to ensure that those reductions will be enforced, that we won't return to our wayward spending ways. And we need to deal with the two-thirds of the budget that represents the big money, namely the entitlements. And there are ways to do that that don't represent big benefit cuts and that don't represent slashing payments to providers so that we won't have any more doctors to take care of us. We can effectuate significant reforms that will send the right signal not only to our constituents but also to the markets that will have a lot to say about what kind of interest rates we have in the future, for example, and whether or not they believe in the recovery that we would like to achieve. Mr. President, I hope that my colleagues will be very open to the consideration of the balanced budget amendment when we bring that up. I wish the President and the leaders of the House and the Senate all the best in their discussions now on how to deal with this problem. The President will have to make a decision. Is raising taxes more important than trying to get our budget back in balance through reduced spending? And I think that he'll find there's a great deal of support on both the Democratic and Republican sides with the latter, and that there won't be with the former. But by getting together and achieving those goals here within the next 4 weeks or so, we can both meet the deadline of August 7th that he has set for debt ceiling increase and also get our country on the path toward more fiscal and a sounder fiscal path. We can do that to give confidence both to the markets and to the American people. And we owe our constituents and our children and grandchildren nothing less. Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Utah.
Ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I stand to talk about a looming crisis in this country, a problem that has the potential to affect every American, from every state, from every political party, of every political ideology. That issue relates to our national debt. We've accumulated nearly $15 trillion in debt through the federal government, which is a lot of money. Split up among 300 million Americans, it works out to close to $50,000 a head. A lot of people don't make that much money in a year, and yet that's what every man, woman, and child owns just on a per capita basis the moment they're born. Now, if it's calculated out on the basis of debt per taxpayer, the number is much larger, anywhere between $120,000 and $150,000 per head, depending on how you calculate it, depending on whose numbers you figure. We're now approaching the August 2nd deadline given to us by Secretary Geithner that has been identified as the time by which we must increase our national debt yet again, a debt that has been raised time and time again, resulting in our accumulation of about $10 trillion of new debt in roughly the last decade. This is a problem, and it's a problem that's only going to become more severe the longer we kick this can down the road without doing anything about it to change the way Washington brings money in and the way Washington spends money. I want to talk for a minute first about how Washington brings money in. There are those who have suggested in this town very recently that what we need right now is a tax increase in order to address the debt crisis. I could not disagree more, and I need to state with the greatest emphasis that I'm able to place on this issue that a tax increase is something I would oppose and something that I would devote every ounce of energy in me to opposing. And the reason is we have in Washington something that is not a revenue problem. What we have is a spending problem. The spending is the crisis that we need to address. But on a more fundamental level, we have to remember what we do when we raise taxes. When we raise taxes, we chill investment. It's investment that we rely on for the creation of jobs. Because we have to remember the government doesn't have the power to create jobs because it can't create wealth. It can create policies, and it can adopt laws and regulations designed to promote or deter certain kinds of behavior. It can raise revenue through taxation, but it can't really create wealth. All it can do is set in place certain circumstances that might allow wealth to be created, or in other circumstances might deter new wealth from being created. To have true wealth creation, leading to true job creation, you have to have a circumstance in which willing investors with capital ready to invest have the reasonable assurance and promise that if they invest their money and thereby place it at risk, that any gains resulting from that risky behavior will be gains that inure to their benefit and not taken away by some third party and not taken away by the government. So when we raise taxes, in effect what we're doing is deterring investment at a time when we're hemorrhaging jobs, and we can ill afford to lose any more. Not one more job should be lost as a result of something that the government does. We need to find ways to get the government out of the way so that job creation can occur. But it can't occur whenever we punish the investor, whenever we tell the investor, invest at your own risk, because if you dare to make a profit, we're going to take away more of that money than we have previously been taking away in taxes. For that reason, Mr. President, I continue to emphasize the fact that I will oppose any attempt to address this debt limit crisis by raising taxes, and I will continue to oppose any effort to raise taxes. Spending is the problem. Now, as to the question of how Washington spends money, if the definition of insanity is the practice of doing something again and again, intending or expecting to achieve different results than we've achieved every time in the past, then we would be insane if we approached this debt limit discussion with the same kinds of tired, malfunctioning, unproductive strategies that have been employed in the past, strategies that focus exclusively on immediate cuts or even long-term cuts. Let me explain what I mean. As we approach the debt limit discussion, there will be those who will want to focus a lot of the attention on long-term spending cuts. In other words, they might say, if we're going to raise the debt limit by $1 trillion, then we need to find $1 trillion in cuts that can be made. If we're going to raise it by $2 trillion, then we need to find $2 trillion to cut. But of course, we can't cut $1 trillion out of our budget immediately. That's not possible. We can't do that in 1 year. It would have to be stretched over a period of many years. Most likely, in this scenario, as it's been discussed, it would be stretched over a period of a decade or more. Now, we do have the power to control what we do in this Congress. But we can't bind the Congress that will take power in January of 2013 or in January of 2015 or 2017. Every 2 years we get a new Congress in place, and that Congress has the power to make those decisions that will best fit what they decide is in order at that time. We can't bind them permanently. And so any promise that we make right now to cut, let's say, $2 trillion relies on the promise that that will be honored by future Congresses. We can't bind them to do that. There is one way, however, that we can bind them. That is by amending, for the 28th time, that 224-year-old document that has fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. When we amend the U.S. Constitution, that is the one credible way, the one binding way in which one group of Americans can bind a future group of Americans. And that's why I've said that the only circumstance in which I think it's appropriate for us to raise the debt limit is a circumstance in which Congress has first passed a balanced budget amendment out of Congress by the requisite two-thirds margin in this body and in the House of Representatives and submitted it to the states for ratification. In that scenario, and only in that scenario, can we proceed with any degree of confidence that the commitments we make now to the American people, to make not just immediate cuts, but long-term changes to the way that we spend money, it's only in that scenario that those promises can be and will be honored, because it's only in that scenario that we can bind a future Congress. That's why I've pledged to vote against and to oppose in any way I can any debt limit increase that involves something short of prior passage of a balanced budget amendment, in addition to any caps, in addition to any immediate cuts that may be made. So we've got to have cuts. We've got to have some kind of spending cap where we cap spending as a percentage of gross domestic product every year. And we've got to have a constitutional amendment requiring that and requiring that revenues and outlays match each other from year to year. If we don't have this, then we're at great risk for the practice of perpetual deficit spending, in which Congress year in and year out spends more than it takes in. Now, Congress can sustain this for a period of time, but where, as is now the case, the amount of money that Congress spends is in excess of $1.5 trillion a year, more than it brings in, we've reached a certain point of unsustainability, a point at which, if we continue with this practice, we'll get to the point where a halt in borrowing will be much more immediate, much more draconian than anything that could be within our control. At some point, those who would be willing to loan us that money, would be willing to buy U.S. Treasury instruments of one form or another to finance our debt, will eventually start demanding a higher and a higher yield, which means that instead of spending about $250 billion a year on interest on our national debt, as we're currently paying, the time could very soon come in which we might have to pay something closer to $700 billion a year just to pay the interest on our national debt. In fact, if we were now required to pay interest rates on our Treasury instruments that are consistent with the 40-year average, we'd be about there. Now, $700 billion is a lot of money. $700 billion in a year is roughly what we spend on Social Security. It's roughly what we spend on Medicare and Medicaid combined in a year. It's roughly what we spend in national defense in an entire year. If we have to spend that amount of money every year, as we could easily have to spend within just a few years' time if we continue spending at this rate, that's going to crowd out funding for every federal program out there. So whether you're most concerned, as many conservatives might be, about protecting national defense, or whether you're most concerned, as many liberals are, about protecting our entitlement programs, you ought to insist, as I've insisted, that we will not raise the debt limit until such time as Congress has passed a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That's why I'm pleased to support the cut, cap, and balance pledge, and why I will continue to take this position, in addition to standing firm on my position that we ought not even consider any tax increase at a time when we can least afford it. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated and
Without objection.
allowed to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this is a pivotal moment in the history of our country. In the coming days and weeks, decisions will be made about our national budget that will impact the lives of virtually every American in this country for decades to come. And the time is now for the American people to become significantly involved in that debate and not leave it to a small number of people here in Washington. Mr. President, at a time when the wealthiest people and the largest corporations in our country are doing phenomenally well, and in many cases have never had it so good, while the middle class is disappearing and poverty is increasing, it is absolutely imperative that any deficit reduction package that passes this Congress not include the horrendous cuts, the cruel cuts in programs that working people desperately need, that are utilized every day by the elderly, by the sick, by our children, and by the lowest income people in our country, that the Republicans in Congress, dominated by their extreme right wing, are demanding. America is not about giving tax breaks to billionaires and attacking the most vulnerable people in our country. We must not allow that to happen. In my view, the President of the United States needs to stand with the vast majority of the American people and say no to the Republican leadership and make it clear that enough is enough. No, we will not balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable people in this country, on our children, on our seniors, on the sick. No, we will not do that. Working families in this country have already sacrificed enough in terms of lost jobs, lost wages, lost homes, lost pensions. The working families of this country are hurting right now. Enough is enough. But, Mr. President, now is the time to say to the millionaires and the billionaires in this country and to the largest corporations, who in many ways have never had it so good, that they must participate in deficit reduction, that there must be shared sacrifice, that deficit reduction cannot be based on cutting back on the needs of working families and the middle class, but the rich and large corporations have also got to participate in this process. Furthermore, it is absolutely necessary, if we are talking about a sensible deficit reduction package, that we take a hard look at unnecessary and wasteful spending at the Pentagon. And, Mr. President, let us make it very clear that we will not be blackmailed again by the Republican leadership in Washington, who are threatening to destroy the full faith and credit of the United States government, so that for the very first time in our nation's history, we might not pay the bills that we owe. That is their threat. We will destroy the record of always paying our bills, never failing to do that, unless they get everything they want. Instead of yielding to the incessant, extreme Republican demands, as the President in many respects did in last December's tax cut agreement and this year's spending negotiations, the President has got to get out of the Beltway. He has to connect with the needs of working families and ordinary Americans and rally the overwhelming majority of our people who believe that deficit reduction must be based on shared sacrifice, that the wealthy and the powerful and the large corporations cannot continue to get everything they want while we wage a cruel and unprecedented attack on the most vulnerable people in this country. It is time for President Obama to stand with the millions who have already lost their jobs, their homes, their life savings, instead of the millionaires who in many cases have never had it so good. Unless the American people in huge numbers tell the President not to yield 1 inch to Republican demands to destroy Medicare and Medicaid while continuing to provide tax breaks to the wealthy and the powerful, unless the American people rise up and say enough is enough, I am afraid that what will happen is the President will yield once again, and the wealthy and the powerful will laugh all the way to the bank while working people will be devastated. So today I am asking the American people that if you believe that deficit reduction should be about shared sacrifice, if you believe that the wealthiest people in our country and the largest corporations should be asked to pay their fair share as part of deficit reduction, if you believe that at a time when military spending has almost tripled since 1997, that we begin to take a hard look at our defense budget, and if you believe that the middle class and working families have already sacrificed enough, I urge you to make sure that the President hears your voice, and he needs to hear it now. I would urge the American people to go to my website, sanders.senate.gov, and sign a letter to the President letting him know that enough is enough. I would also urge the American people to contact the White House directly through their website and leave a message for the President there. As you know, Mr. President, this country faces enormous challenges. In fact, we have not suffered through such a difficult moment since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The reality is that we don't talk about it very much, but the reality is that the middle class in this country is disappearing, while at the same time poverty is increasing. When we talk about the state of our economy, and it is important to talk about it within the context of deficit reduction, Because when you understand what's going on in the economy, you know that you can't get blood out of a stone. You cannot keep attacking people who have been devastated in the last few years in terms of unemployment, in terms of losses of pension, in terms of losses of health care. So when we talk about the economy, we have got to understand that the situation is in many cases even worse than official statistics indicate. For example, we read in the papers that the official unemployment rate is now 9.1%. But the truth of the matter is, and no economist disagrees with this, that that official statistic ignores the number of people who have given up looking for work and people who are working part-time when they want to work full-time. If you add all of that together, you're looking at a real unemployment rate in this country of about 16%. 16%. Are those really the people that we should go to for deficit reduction? Are they not suffering enough right now? Young people graduating college can't find a job. Let's hit them hard. Older people have lost their jobs, can't find a new one, or working for half the wages that they previously worked at. Let's go after those people. 50 million people have no health insurance. Let's attack them. Working mothers and fathers can't find affordable child care. Let's go after them. Mr. President, we must understand that when we look at the economy, the middle class is hurting and hurting badly. Over the last 10 years, on top of the high unemployment rates, the median family income in this country has declined by over $2,500. You know why working families are angry? That's why they're angry. They're working longer hours for lower wages. And are those really the people that you want to ask to balance the budget? I don't think so. I think any sense of fairness, any sense of morality that one might have suggests you don't beat up on people who are already suffering. You don't try to get blood out of a stone. Mr. President, as a result of the greed and the recklessness and the illegal behavior on Wall Street, which caused this terrible recession, millions more Americans have lost their homes. They've lost their pensions and they've lost their retirement savings. We hear it every day in calls that come to our offices. And unless we reverse our current economic course, our children will have, for the very first time in modern American history, a lower standard of living than their parents. It's the American dream in reverse. Kids are going to do worse than their parents unless we reverse current economic trends. Mr. President, we can throw out a lot of numbers around here, a few $100 billion and $1 trillion, but the truth of the matter is that behind those numbers in my state of Vermont and all over this country, there are real people who are hurting terribly. And as members of the United States Senate, our job is to pay attention to those people and not just the well-paid lobbyists representing the most powerful special interests in the world who surround this Capitol every single day. Mr. President, last year I asked my constituents in Vermont to share some personal stories with me. I asked them basically, you know, how are you doing in this recession? And the stories that I got back from Vermont, I am sure, are absolutely similar to the stories that you would get in Delaware or anyone would get in Michigan or any other state in this country. But I asked them, how are things going? And let me just tell you that as a result of the email that we sent out, we had more than 400 Vermonters responding to that email. And what they had to say was poignant. Sometimes these stories were so powerful it was almost hard to read more than a few at a time. And the messages that I received from Vermont, and I suspect similar messages coming from every state in this country, is that people are finding it hard to get jobs or now working for lower wages than they used to earn. We're seeing older workers who have depleted their life savings and they're worried about how they're going to retire, what happens to them when they're unable to work anymore, who's going to take care of them. We hear from young adults in their 20s and 30s who are deeply in debt from college loans, and they don't know how they're going to pay off those loans. We hear from people of all ages, all walks of life, from every corner of Vermont, who have sent us their stories. And let me just read a few of them, just to make the point, to put some flesh and blood behind the statistics that we often throw out. We got a letter from a 51-year-old woman from central Vermont, and this is what she wrote. She said, "Dear Senator Sanders, don't really know what to say. I could cry. My significant other was out of work for a year. Now he works in another state. I've been out of work since April. Our mortgage company wants the house because we can't make the payments. I can't find a job to save my soul that will pay enough to make a difference. How bad does it have to get? My mother went through the Great Depression, and here we go again. I figure that I'm going to lose everything soon. I'm a well-educated person who can't see through the fog." End of quote. A gentleman in his mid-50s writes from Orange County, Vermont, and this is what he writes. "After being unemployed 3 times since 1999 due to global trade agreements, I now find myself managing a hazardous waste transfer facility that pays about 25% less than what I was making in 1999. And, Mr. President, you hear that all of the time. Yes, many people, of course, are working, but many older workers today are dealing with the humiliation and the economic tragedy of now earning substantially less than they earned 10 or 20 years ago." And he continues, "My wife's children have moved back in unemployed, and we are saving very little for retirement. If things don't improve soon, we will likely have to work until we die. We consider ourselves lucky that we are employed. Our children's friends tend to show up around mealtime. They are skinny. We feed them. This is no recession. It's a modern-day depression." Mr. President, are those the people that we really want to go after when we talk about deficit reduction? Are they not suffering enough already? A woman in her late 40s from Westminster, Vermont, writes, quote, "I'm a single mom in Vermont, nearly 50. I patched together a full-time job making $12 an hour and various painting jobs and still can't afford to get myself out of debt or make necessary repairs on my home. No other jobs in sight. I apply all the time to no avail. Food and gas bills go up and up, but not my income. I have no retirement at all. Can't afford to move. Feeling stuck, tired, and hopeless." Stuck, tired, and hopeless. I suspect that sentiment reflects how many, many millions of Americans are feeling today. Got another letter from a 26-year-old man from Barre, Vermont, and he writes, quote, "In 2002, I received a scholarship to St. Bonaventure University, the first in my family to attend college. Upon graduation in 2006, I was admitted to the Dickinson School of Law at Penn State University and graduated in 2009 with $150,000 of student loan. $150,000. That's high. But there are people all over this country who have extremely high student loans, and they don't know how they're going to pay them off." And then he continues, "In Western New York, I could find nothing better than a $10 an hour position stuffing envelopes. I live in a small studio apartment in Barre without cable or internet. I have told my family I don't want them to visit because I am ashamed of my surroundings. My family always told me that an education was the ticket to success. But all my education seems to have done in this landscape is make it impossible to pull myself out of debt and begin a successful career." End of quote. Mr. President, on and on it goes. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing in my office on the crisis in dental care, the fact that in Vermont and all over this country, we've got millions of people who can't find a dentist. I just want to give you an idea. I'm raising these issues today, and I'm quoting from folks in Vermont. And by the way, again, these stories are not just Vermont. Vermont, in fact, is doing better in this recession than most states in the country are. So take what we're talking about here in Vermont and multiply it several times for other states. But a gentleman writes to me just within the last couple of weeks. He says, "I can't afford health insurance, so dental work is definitely out. and he talks about how studies have linked bad dental care to heart problems and cancer, but he can't get to a dentist. So, Mr. President, the reason I raise these issues is to try to give us a better understanding of who some of the people are that will be impacted by the draconian cuts that the Republicans are talking about. Let us be clear. They are talking about throwing millions and millions of people off of Medicaid. And let me tell you what that means. Earlier this year, as you know, Arizona passed budget cuts that took patients off its transplant list. Remember reading about that? Most of the country read about that. And essentially, because of financial reasons, what they said in Arizona is, yes, you need a transplant. Yes, you are not all that old, but I'm sorry, we can't afford it for you, and you're going to have to die. And people have died. And in that state and in other states throughout this country, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are being thrown off of Medicaid. So what does that mean? What does it mean if you are a low-income worker and you are getting your health insurance through Medicaid and you lose that Medicaid? What happens when you develop a pain in your chest and you think you may be having a heart problem, but you can't get to a doctor? What happens? Have our Republican friends thought that through when they proposed $700 billion in cuts in Medicaid? What happens to the children by the millions who are thrown off of Medicaid? We have 50 million people today who have no health insurance. If the Republican plan goes through, we're talking about tens of millions more. What happens to those people? As Americans, are we content to see kids get sick because they can't get to a doctor, or people die because they don't get to a doctor on time? I don't think so. Mr. President, I have learned and been told throughout my whole life that education is the key to success. And we hear that on the floor of this Senate every single day. Education, education. Kids have got to do well in high school so they'll be able to go to college. The reality right now is that hundreds of thousands of bright young people cannot afford to go to college because they just don't have the money. And as a nation, we are losing their intellectual capabilities to make us a stronger nation. If the Republicans get their way and make savage cuts in Pell Grants, there is no doubt, no one has any doubt, that hundreds of thousands more young people will never be able to walk into a college or a university. And that is not only a tragedy for the individuals, for the young people themselves. It is a tragedy for this nation. Every day we are involved in fierce competition in the global economy, and we are not doing well at educational levels. We are seeing other countries graduate more of their students from college, and that gap is growing wider. And if you cut back on Pell Grants and other forms of college aid, it is clear that a bad situation will be made much worse. But let's get even more basic than health care, more basic than education. That comes to nutrition. Whether people in larger and larger numbers in this country are going to go hungry. Mr. President, according to a 2009 study, there are over 5 million seniors who face the threat of hunger, almost 3 million who are at risk of going hungry, and almost 1 million seniors who do go hungry because they cannot afford to buy food. And in that context, our Republican friends want to balance the budget on the backs of the hungry, cut back on food stamps, cut back on other nutrition programs. So what happens if you're 80 and food prices are going up and you don't have enough to eat? Well, apparently there are some people here in the Senate who don't worry about that But I personally do not believe that that is what America is about, and I think the American people, by huge numbers, do not want to see hunger increase for our seniors or our children. Mr. President, this is a lot of pain that the Republicans are tossing out, while at the same time they are vigorously protecting their wealthy and powerful friends. In my view, the President of the United States has got to stand tall. He has got to take the case to the American people, and he has got to hold the Republicans responsible if, in fact, the debt ceiling is not raised, and all of the repercussions that will occur if that happens. Mr. President, I've given you just an inkling of what is going on in the real world, and I know all over this country, ordinary Americans, working-class people have a lot more to say about what is going on in their lives. As we speak, people are fighting desperately to keep their homes from falling into foreclosure. They're struggling with 29%, 30% interest rates on their credit card, which they're never able to pay off. Marriages have been postponed because the young people don't have the money to settle down. Lives have been derailed. Retirement savings have been raided to pay for college tuition or to keep businesses afloat, or to simply put gas in the car at $3.80 a gallon in order to get to work. That is what is going on in the real world. That is what it means when we talk about the middle class collapsing and poverty is increasing. And, Mr. President, while all of that happens, it is important to note that there is another economic reality taking place in this country. Poverty is increasing. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. We're seeing an increase in senior citizens who are going hungry, more and more families unable to send their kids to college. But there is another reality out there, and that is that the gap between the wealthiest people in this country and everybody else is growing wider and wider, and has not been this wide since just before the Great Depression of 1929 began. And let us be very clear, and there's nothing to be proud about, but the United States today has by far the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth. Today, Mr. President, the top 1% earns over 20% of all income in this country, which is more than the bottom 50%. 1% owns more income than the bottom 50%. Over a recent 25-year period, 80% of all new income created in this country went to the top 1%. Even more dramatic, even more incredible, even more unfair in terms of distribution of wealth, which is accumulated income. As hard as it may be to comprehend, in America today, the top 400 individuals own more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans. 400 Americans own more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans. Now, Mr. President, given those realities, it doesn't take a Ph.D. in economics to suggest that when we move forward with deficit reduction, that deficit reduction must include shared sacrifice, that the wealthy and large corporations also have got to help this country deal with record-breaking deficit. Mr. President, the reality is simple but unfortunate. And that reality is that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class continues to disappear. And that is what is going on in this country, and there is no hiding it. We have got to acknowledge it, and we've got to go on from there. Mr. President, everyone knows that in our country today, we are facing a major deficit crisis, and we have a national debt of over $14 trillion. What has not been widely discussed, and what must be discussed, is how we got into that deficit situation in the first place. If you're going to deal with the deficit, you got to know how you got into it. And what is very, very clear is that this huge record-breaking deficit and a $14 trillion national debt did not just happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened, in fact, as a result of a number of policy decisions made over the last decade and votes that were cast right here on the floor of the Senate and in the House of Representatives. When we talk about the deficit and when we talk about the national debt, let us never forget that in January of 2001, a little over 10 years ago, when President Bill Clinton left office, this country had an annual federal budget surplus of $236 billion, with projected budget surpluses as far as the eye could see. That was when Clinton left office some 10 years ago. And now we have a $1.5 trillion deficit and a growing national debt. It is totally appropriate, as we talk about deficit reduction, that we ask the simple question: how did we get to where we are today in terms of the deficit? What happened in that ensuing 10 years? How did we go from huge projected surpluses into horrendous debt? And the answer, Mr. President, really is not complicated, and there's not a lot of disagreement. We know exactly what has happened. The Congressional Budget Office has documented it. There was an interesting article on the front page of the Washington Post on April 30th talking about it as well. And here's what happened. And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement about this. Mr. President, when our nation spends $1 trillion on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and forgets to pay for those wars, we run up a deficit. When we provide over $700 billion in tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country and choose not to offset those tax breaks, we run up a deficit. When we pass a Medicare Part D prescription drug program written by the drug companies and the insurance companies that does not allow Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices and ends up costing us far more than it should, $400 billion over a 10-year period, and we don't pay for that, we run up the deficit. When we double military spending since 1997, not including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we don't pay for that, we run up the deficit. Now, Mr. President, I always find it amusing that when some of my Republican colleagues come down here onto the floor and they lecture some of us about how serious the deficit is and how serious the national debt is. And yet, ironically, many of us voted against those proposals, which in fact caused the deficit crisis that we are in right now. And I paid a lot of attention during the debate over the war in Iraq. I don't recall many of our friends on the Republican side or the Democrats who voted for that war saying, gee, we can't go to war because it's going to cost this country a huge sum of money. Don't remember hearing that. And when we bailed out Wall Street to the tune of $700 billion, don't recall many of my friends saying, oh, my goodness, we can't afford to do that. And when we gave $700 billion in tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, where was the concern then about deficit reduction? And further, Mr. President, and maybe even most significantly, the deficit that we're in right now was caused by the recession that we're in, which was, of course, caused by the greed and illegal behavior on Wall Street, which caused the economic condition of the moment, massive unemployment, and loss of a very substantial amount of revenue that otherwise would have come into our tax coffers. Mr. President, the end result of all of these unpaid-for policies and actions year after year of the deficits I just described is a staggering amount of debt. When President Bush left office, President Obama inherited an annual deficit of $1.3 trillion with deficits as far as the eye could see, and the national debt more than doubled under President Bush because of all of these policy decisions made by Republicans and some Democrats. So the reality is, Mr. President, if we did not go to war in Iraq, if we did not pass huge tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires, if we did not pass a prescription drug program with no cost control written by the drug and insurance companies, and if we did not deregulate Wall Street, which allowed them to do the things that they did, which ended up in Wall Street's collapse and the ensuing recession, we would not find ourselves in the mess we are in today. It really is that simple. In other words, the only reason we have to increase our nation's debt ceiling today is that we are forced to pay the bills that the Republican leadership in Congress and some Democrats and President Bush racked up. Now, Mr. President, given the decline in the middle class, given the increase in poverty, and given the fact that the wealthy and large corporations have never had it so good, Americans might find it strange that the Republicans in Washington would use this moment to make savage cuts in Medicare, Medicaid, education, nutrition assistance, and other life and death programs, while at the same time pushing for even more tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations. Unfortunately, while the average American may think this is pretty weird, inside the Beltway, that is exactly what happens. And this is very much part of the Republican ideology. Republicans in Washington have never really believed in Medicaid or in Medicare or in federal assistance in education or providing any direct government assistance to those in need. They have always believed that tax breaks for the wealthy and the powerful would somehow miraculously trickle down to every American despite all history and all evidence to the contrary. So in that sense, it is not strange at all that they would use the deficit crisis we are now in as an opportunity for an ideological attack against some of the most vulnerable people in our country. And that, Mr. President, is exactly what the Ryan Republican budget that was passed in the House of Representatives earlier this year and supported by the vast majority of Republicans here in the Senate just last month. That's what that budget is all about. Let me just give you, it's a long budget, let me just give you a few examples of what the Ryan Republican budget would do. The Republican budget passed by the House this year would end Medicare as we know it within 10 years. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that under the Ryan proposal, in 2022, a private health care plan for a 65-year-old equivalent to Medicare coverage would cost about $20,500. Yet the Republican budget would provide a voucher for only $8,000 of those premiums. Seniors would be on their own to pay the remaining $12,500, a full 61% of the total. Now, how many of the 20 million near elderly Americans who are now ages 50 to 54 will be able to afford that? So let's review what we have. Let's say when you become 65 in 10 years, and you are earning or living on $15,000 in Social Security, you are going to be asked to pay $12,500 more for health care than is currently the case. How do you do that? How do you do that? What kind of health care plan are you going to buy when you are old and sick and are given an $8,000 voucher? How many days in the hospital will you be able to have? You can run up an $8,000 bill in 1 day, in 2 days. So this ending of Medicare as we know it, forcing seniors to somehow come up with all kinds of money that in many cases they don't have, will be a disaster for tens of millions of people. The Republican budget would also force 4 million seniors in this country to pay $3,500 more on average for their prescription drugs by reopening the Medicare Part D donut hole, and that goes into effect as soon as that bill would be passed, if it were to be passed. Under the Republican budget, nearly 2 million children would lose their health insurance over the next 5 years by cuts to the Children's Health Insurance Program, according again to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. Mr. President, at a time when 50 million Americans have no health insurance, the Republican budget would cut Medicaid by over $770 billion, causing millions and millions of Americans to lose their health insurance and cut nursing home assistance in half. Right now, Medicaid pays the lion's share of nursing home care. You make savage cuts in Medicaid. What happens to the elderly who are in nursing homes, and what happens to their kids, their children, in terms of trying to provide the help that their parents desperately need? The Republican budget would completely repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, preventing an estimated 34 million uninsured Americans from getting the health insurance they need. And at a time when the cost of college education is becoming out of reach for so many Americans, the Republican budget would slash college Pell Grants by about 60% next year alone, reducing the maximum award from $5,500 to $2,100. Mr. President, at a time when over 40 million Americans don't have enough money to feed themselves or their families, the Republican budget would kick some 10 million Americans off of food stamps. Now, what kind of sense of morality is that? That when people today are struggling hard in order to feed themselves, we throw another 10 million people off of food stamps. Mr. President, it is no secret to anyone that our nation's infrastructure is crumbling. The Republican budget passed in the House and supported by all but a handful of Republicans here in the Senate would slash funding for our roads, bridges, rail lines, transit systems, and airports by nearly 40% next year alone. And one of two things happen. Either as a result of this, our infrastructure continues to deteriorate, or else hard-pressed cities and towns are going to have to raise property taxes and other regressive taxes in order to come up with a differential. Yet, despite the fact that we talked about cuts in health care, Medicare, Medicaid, education, nutrition, environmental protection, yet despite all of those cuts, when it comes to military spending, which has tripled since 1997, the House Republican budget does nothing to reduce unnecessary defense spending. In fact, defense spending would go up by $26 billion next year alone under the Republican plan. Interestingly enough, at a time when the rich are becoming richer, when the effective tax rates for the wealthiest people at 18% are about the lowest on record, at a time when the top 2% have received hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks, at a time when corporate profits are at an all-time high and major corporations making billions of dollars in profits are not paying a nickel in taxes, my Republican colleagues, in their approach to a deficit reduction, does not ask the wealthiest people in this country or the largest corporations to contribute 1 penny to a deficit reduction. Poverty is increasing. Republicans cut programs for the most vulnerable people in this country. Middle class is disappearing in need of great help. Republicans cut the safety line off from them. The rich who are getting richer and large corporations making huge profits and in many cases not paying anything in taxes at all, what their requirement is to receive even more in terms of tax breaks. Now, that may make sense to some people. It does not make sense to me. In fact, what the Republicans want to do is provide over $1 trillion in tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires by permanently extending all of the Bush income tax cuts, reducing the estate tax for multimillionaires and billionaires, and lowering the top individual and corporate income tax rates from 35% to 25%. Rich get richer, they get tax breaks. Poor get poorer, they lose the ability to send their kids to college or nutrition programs or health care. Mr. President, the Republican idea of moving toward a balanced budget is to go after the middle class, working families, and low-income people, and to make sure that millionaires and billionaires and the largest corporations in this country that are in many cases doing phenomenally well right now do not have to share in the sacrifices being made by everybody else. They will be protected. The Republican approach to deficit reduction in Washington is the Robin Hood philosophy in reverse. We take from the poorest people and we give to the richest people. And it's not as if that approach is good for our economy. Mark Zandi, the former economic advisor to John McCain, when he was running for president, has estimated that the Republican budget plan will cost 1.7 million jobs by the year 2014, with 900,000 jobs lost next year alone. The House Republican budget is breathtaking in its degree of cruelty. But don't take my word for it. In a letter to congressional leaders after the House GOP plan was introduced, nearly 200 economists and health care experts wrote, and I quote, "Turning Medicare into a voucher program would undermine essential protections for millions of vulnerable people. It would extinguish the most promising approaches to curb costs and to improve the American medical care system." End of quotes. Ezra Klein, a columnist at the Washington Post, wrote last April that, and I quote, "The budget Ryan released is not courageous or serious or significant. It's a joke and a bad one. For one thing, Ryan's savings all come from cuts, and at least two-thirds of them come from programs serving the poor. The wealthy, meanwhile, would see their taxes lowered, and the Defense Department would escape unscathed. It is not courageous to attack the weak while supporting your party's most inane and damaging fiscal orthodoxies. But the problem isn't just that Ryan's budget is morally questionable. It also wouldn't work." Mr. President, the deficit that we are struggling with right now has been caused by unpaid-for wars, tax breaks for the rich, a Medicare Part D prescription drug program written by the insurance companies, the bailout of Wall Street, a declining economy, and less revenue coming into our Treasury. The Republican solution, in quotes, is to balance the budget on the backs of the sick, the elderly, the children, and the poor, to cut back on environmental protection, to cut back on transportation, while providing even more tax breaks to those who don't need it. That is unacceptable, and that is what the American people have got to stop. Mr. President, it is not just wealthy individuals who are making out like bandits. As hard as it may be to believe, some of the largest, most profitable corporations in this country are not only avoiding paying any federal income taxes whatsoever, but they are actually receiving tax rebates from the IRS. And the Republican response to this reality is to provide even more tax breaks to these corporate freeloaders. That may make sense to someone. It does not make sense to me. And what I want to do, Mr. President, and I would ask unanimous consent to do this, is to introduce a list of a number of corporations who are making huge profits and who are paying virtually nothing in taxes and in some cases getting a rebate.
Without objection.